Fantasy football playoffs are in full swing.
Whether or not your team is still alive, the reason you're playing at all is largely because of two Minnesota men you've probably never heard of. Fantasy football has become one of those cultural touchstones that almost everybody takes part in. Nearly everyone watches the Super Bowl, fills out a March Madness bracket, or plays fantasy football. But the Minnesota men who helped it become so popular have been mostly forgotten. Tonight, Dave McCoy brings us their story.
In the basement of his duplex in Maplewood, Cliff Charpentier is literally digging through the past.
Oh my God. Tommy, here.
In the early days of fantasy football, the 80s, way before the internet, when there were maybe 1/50th the number of players there are now, there was almost nothing published about fantasy football. There was nothing on TV, there was nothing on radio. For those of us that were playing back then, it's hard to overstate just how important that one book was.
Paul Charchian is the president of the Fantasy Sports Trade Association and a lifelong Minnesotan, which means he had a front row seat back in the beginning when Minnesota was the mecca of fantasy football, and Cliff Charpentier and Tom Kane were the kings.
Those guys were absolute pioneers. They deserve a lot of credit for helping popularize fantasy sports.
But there's a catch.
Because the overwhelming majority of fantasy players got into fantasy sports within the last 10 years,
98% of people playing today have never heard of them. It's time to change that. This is their story.
I presented it to him as, I think this is going to fly. This is going to be big.
we started.
Cliff was the writer. Tom was the business guy. Old high school buddies from St. Paul Johnson, they had an idea to put out a book, all the fantasy football advice you could want to make the game more accessible.
I'm going to rate all the players for you, make it so easy so the average NFL fan could play. We took away the work for you. Buy the book.
Who else was doing this at that time?
Nobody. Nobody.
Warren Moon.
Working out of Cliff's mom's basement,
Joe Montana.
they put their first one out in 1984.
Tommy Kramer, Minnesota.
Self-published.
Should return to again ignite Minnesota's high-volume passing offense.
The first year in the Twin Cities, we sold 3,000 books. And we knew we were on to something.
Then came a call from a prominent publisher. And before long, Fantasy Football Digest was a national sensation.
USA Today calls it the Bible
Yeah.
of fantasy football.
Their book made it so easy to play, participation soared.
You got Brett Favre, Randy Moss.
Later came magazines, launching in 1996.
The Rams, you remember how good the Rams were back then?
Yeah, Mike Martz. Quite an offense.
They added subscription newsletters, cheat sheets,
Everything you needed to know.
commissioner software, telephone hotline, and fax machine updates.
We are showing our age.
The fax machine was quite lucrative.
It was
Very lucrative.
But as technology continued to evolve, so did the challenges and challengers. And in 2002, they put out their last issues and called it quits.
What changed? Why did this end for you guys?
The internet.
Free. We could feel the kind of where this was going.
To compete with free, they were faced with a choice: change their entire business model or get out. So they got out. Neither has played fantasy football since.
It burned us out, and you would think, oh my God, these guys love fantasy football. I just can't play ever again.
But the legacy they left behind, putting fantasy football on the map, and the map being in Minnesota, is something people might not know, but should know.
It was fun to promote the game.
David McCoy, WCCO 4 Sports.
The number of people playing fantasy football went from a few 100,000 when they started to nearly 7 million when they finished. It's now about 60 million nationwide.